Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, and the Conservative Party conference here is in full swing. We're up here for one of the most politically charged and important discussions we've had on Start the Week. In essence, whether or not Britain's military involvement overseas does any good at all. Rory Stewart is a Conservative MP, former soldier, former diplomat, including in Iraq, who asks in his new book, Can Intervention Work? This is a tale which certainly includes the role of spooks, and the BBC's Gordon Corera has written a new history of MI6, teasing out the racy fiction of Le Carré and Ian Fleming from the facts recalled by former spies. Rosemary Hollis of London City University has been studying our latest intervention, very much in today's headlines, in Libya. But we're going to start with one of the most devastating books on British policy I have read. Frank Ledwidge is a former military intelligence officer, and the title of his angry and detailed book says it all. He's called it simply Losing Small Wars, British Military Failure in Afghanistan and Iraq. Frank, let's talk first of all about Iraq, the Basra failure. And you would describe these, both what's happened in Basra and what's still happening in Helmand, as defeats.
Certainly Basra was a defeat, a serious defeat, and I'd categorise it possibly as the most humiliating British military adventure certainly since the Second World War and arguably since Singapore. I mean, you can't compare the casualties, but certainly I think the impact are comparable.
And in essence, to remind people, we went in to protect and help the people of this important, very large southern city in Iraq. And really quite quickly, we in effect handed control to the local bad guys and retreated, in your view, to a little bastion camp outside.
Yes, the city was essentially surrendered to a fairly savage bunch of militias on the basis that these now constituted the police. Of course, there was a rhetoric to this, and that rhetoric, as you mentioned, revolved around protecting the people. I mean, the military rhetoric of entering Basra, protecting the people and looking after their interests. And what the people of Basra, the Basra'is, wanted was simple security, and devolving responsibility for that security to a bunch of religious, fanatical militias was a serious dereliction of duty. And we let them seriously down and constituted a surrender, in my view.
And many, many people actually had to leave Basra and have got into exile as a result of Britain's involvement.
Yes, the Christian population is essentially eviscerated. It's essentially no longer there. The Jewish population disappeared a long time ago. The Shia population of Basra, of course, has suffered serious casualties. And the Sunnis, of course, in Basra, are subject to something like ethnic cleansing. Now, there are some left, but it's been a very, very unpleasant time now. And I was told last week concerning security in Basra, I was thinking of going back and seeing what we'd achieved, and I was told you will last 30 minutes on the streets of Basra now before being kidnapped.
Why do we never read in the news that we were defeated in Basra? I mean, why does no one talk about this?
I think there's a political consensus, an understandable political consensus, but also there's the very, very legitimate aspect of looking after the interests and morale of our troops. Now, you will find nothing in my book critical of the British soldier. As a defence force, they're second to none. If we're attacked by conventional forces, if you're taken hostage, you can rely on British troops to defend you and to rescue you. However, when we come to fighting wars like this, the legends we've beguiled ourselves with of Malaya, Northern Ireland, simply don't apply.
See, I think if you stopped most people in the street and you said what happened in Basra, if they remembered it at all, they'd say, "Oh, we sorted Basra out, didn't we? We did well, and we've moved on."
Well, we certainly moved on, and in one sense we sorted Basra out.
And we were rescued in the end. It was the Americans who had to come in.
we were bailed out. We were bailed out by the Americans and the Iraqi army in early 2008.
And you argue that what then happened in southern Afghanistan, in Helmand province, was partly a result of what had gone wrong in Afghanistan.
In
Iraq.
So. I believe explicitly so, and several generals have got themselves into a bit of hot water over this since. There was an explicit declaration, I think, or an explicit feeling that we have to make up for the disappointment, let's put it like that, they felt of Iraq. Afghanistan is available. That's something we can do. This is the British Army's kind of war. Let's get on in there and do it.
Let's crack on.
Crack on.
And what happened?
Well, very much the same pattern. We went in there without the slightest idea of what we were supposed to be doing. As the Chief of Joint Operations said, before entering Basra, we knew Helmand, we knew very little about that province. Well, of course, we did know something. The Special Air Service had been there for several years. They'd advised on this matter. There was a British Army and civilian joint team that had recommended a certain way of dealing with it. But we sent in a highly kinetic means highly
aggressive,
yes, military unit armed with all the paraphernalia of the Cold War, attack helicopters, armoured vehicles, strike jets, to fight a war against an enemy of which we knew nothing, amongst people of which we knew less. The people of it needs to be remembered that Helmand, with the arguable exception of Londonderry or West Belfast, is probably the least suitable place for historical reasons into which to insert British troops.
Because of the imperial wars, which people there still remember.
I think there is a historical aspect to this, yes. Some people regard the Great Game as little more than that. That's not how it's seen, as Rory may say, in Afghanistan. The British are seen there as a rather rapacious and serially abusive imperial power. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that's how we're seen in places like Helmand. We are the enemy. And the tradition there, of course, is to fight enemies, to fight invaders. Now, that's not the end of the matter, of course. Was the thing doomed from the start? No. Had we defined our aims appropriately, had we set a strategy, had our generals treated this matter in a measured and considered fashion, instead of the way in which it was in fact dealt with, things may have turned out better, or at least the damage that we've done might have been mitigated.
When you're looking, you say rightly that you don't criticise the soldiers.
That's right.
However, you do criticise pretty ferociously what you might call the top brass, the MOD, this enormous military superstructure that we now have in this country. The one statistic that just jumped out of this book at me is that we now, and I can hardly believe this is true, we now have more generals in the British Army than we have operational tanks.
Yes, that's correct. We've 350 Challenger 2 tanks, for those who are interested in the figures. Many of those are in storage, so yes, and we have 256 generals in the Army.
And how does that compare to
officers in the other services?
Yes, and similar sort of statistics for the Navy and so on. Right. How does that compare with the Americans, for instance?
One would think that the Americans are even more bureaucratic than us and overborne with senior ranks. That's not the case. The US Marine Corps, which is exactly the same size as give or take 10,000 as the British Armed Forces, and I would suggest, with the exception of the nuclear deterrent, more combat capable, simply because of the resources they have. The US Marine Corps has a total of 86 generals. 86 is limited by statute. We have 500 in our armed forces. That's officers of 1 star or above, NATO rank of generals. The US Army has roughly 4 times the number of generals. We have roughly 4 times pro rata the number of generals as the US Army. The Israelis, again, a force not too different in size from our own, has 48 generals.
It's astonishing. And you would also, just before we open this up for discussion, you also argue that really the quality of our education and our thinking of senior military is very poor, that places like Shrivenham just don't cut it compared to West Point or wherever. Well,
I think it's important that we don't mischaracterise our generals as donkeys. They're not. We've got some really superb senior officers. The trouble is that the way that
far too many of them passing the buck from one to the other is however, your case.
Yes. There were 34 generals gave evidence to the Iraq inquiry, and I defy anyone to tell me which one was responsible, or which several of them were responsible for the Iraq debacle. We have at any one time in Helmand probably in excess of a dozen general officers or more in Afghanistan. But the Americans, they treat their training and development of officers, senior officers, far more differently. I would suggest we're about a generation behind on this kind of thinking. Our generals are focused and shoved through their career rather like a Venturi process. The faster you go, the narrower your perspective. And we need to change that.
Rory Stewart, this is sort of fairly devastating stuff. Do you recognise this picture?
I do. And Andrew, I think also what you've raised about the fact that the British public isn't very aware of this is very important. And I think some of the responsibility needs to lie with journalists. One of the very striking things in Afghanistan and Iraq is that often, although privately correspondents would complain and grumble, when you actually saw their copy or saw their broadcast, they were surprisingly loyal and deferential. Very, very few people seem to have the anger, the interest or the motivation in the press corps to actually expose our failures.
Do you think that there's a sort of just a radical lack of confidence in this very civilian society we live in about anything military? Everybody defers almost too much to the military, and that goes for politicians as well. You can't criticise the military. The Victorians were always sacking their generals and getting rid of them. Gordon Corera.
Yeah, I wonder, Frank, one of the things you say is that there's a failure to speak truth to power by the generals, particularly over Afghanistan. What do you think a more successful relationship would look like? Because some people might also be cautious of a senior officer class who felt very comfortable challenging politicians and not obeying orders, if you like. What's the right balance there?
Well, there are two key examples, I think. The first and most obvious is General Alan Brooke, or Field Marshal Alan Brooke during the war, who had a very, very close relationship with Churchill. And it was a give-and-take relationship. But more specifically, I mean, Alan Brooke, of course, was a very, very senior commander. He was the chief of the Imperial General Staff. It was General Templer in Malaya. Templer, before he deployed to Malaya to command the counterinsurgency force, he demanded of his he asked of his political command, look, I need a clear policy to work on here. And with a clear policy, I can set my strategy. Give me that policy. He got it in writing. What's the political end state? What do we need out of this? And he worked on that basis. We didn't have that kind of relationship in Helmand or Iraq.
Well, I don't want to lose this point about the role of the media and so on. What was the story that we weren't hearing? Now, I don't remember it quite the same as you, Andrew, that we were hearing that it was a success in Basra, but the explanation was murky, and I thought what was not being said by the British was how badly they were getting along with the Americans, more importantly in Baghdad. And I thought there was some excuse for the British in Basra, insofar as it took the Americans a very long time to get organised a central government to pass laws which the British could then help the Iraqis implement as the rule of law. They were basically on their own in Basra, having to work with the locals, and as you point out, not knowing one local from another and one bad guy from one good guy. But weren't they left in the lurch by the Americans?
Oh, absolutely not. On the contrary, they had all the support I think they required. And speaking of Baghdad, I mean, let's not mischaracterise everything. Not everything in the British military effort was a disastrous failure. The Special Air Service worked very closely alongside its American equivalents, essentially to annihilate al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, at least for now. They destroyed the key strategic threat to the mission, very closely working with the Americans. But that American relationship was fractured long before the Americans bailed us out of Basra, I would suggest.
Rory Stewart, the book that you've co-written, you've called Can Intervention Work, and picks up directly from this, because you've looked at both Afghanistan and Iraq. You know them both very well indeed. And you say in this book that part of the problem in Afghanistan was this strange mantra, failure is not an option. Why was that a problem?
It's a problem because it creates this amazing optimism where everybody, and it seems to be not just generals, but politicians, journalists, civil servants on the ground, want to believe good news. So it doesn't matter what's happening, a very positive spin is always put on it. And you see in the most extraordinary way from 2004 onwards, every general conceivable, and almost every politician saying, this year will be the decisive year. 2004 is the decisive year, 2005 is the decisive year, 2006 is the decisive year. Right the way through, Guido Westphali, the German foreign minister, now says 2011 is the decisive year. And nobody ever calls them on it. Nobody ever says, wait a second, you said that 6 years ago, what happened? And the answer is always, we have a new strategy, we have new resources, and this year will be the decisive year. And you saw President Obama say that at the end of last year. So there is an incredible delusion taking place. And for some reason, Victorian generals seem to be better at calling a failure. The great merit of what we did in the 19th century was that once we got ourselves into a mess, we got out of it very quickly. First and Second Anglo-Afghan Wars, very humiliating, but very, very quickly, British acknowledgement that there had been a failure and extraction.
Grown up, taking responsibility, and you would argue, would you, that actually the world would be a safer place and Afghanistan would be, in some respects, a happier country had we never gone there?
No, I believe Afghanistan would have been a happier country if we'd stayed at the level we were at 2002, 3, 4. We become very impatient. We're very, very bad at saying things are going reasonably well, more girls are going back to school, clinics are opening, and we're going to tolerate the fact there are parts of the country which are not as orderly as we'd like. Instead, we develop these fantasies about state building. We begin to believe, bring in more money, bring in more troops, we're going to be able to sort this stuff out. Somebody needed to say in 2004-5, stop. You're doing enough. You don't need to bring in more. It doesn't justify this kind of investment. In fact, you're going to make the situation worse, not better.
Is it possible that we have learned from Afghanistan? And if we look, for instance, at Libya, that's an example of the alternative approach. Do as little as you absolutely need to do and hold back. There's a wonderful Lawrence of Arabia quote that's been cited in the context of your book, where he said, do not try to do too much with your own hands. Better the Arabs do it tolerably than you do it perfectly. It is their war, and you're there to help them, not win it for them.
I think the reason why everybody quotes Lawrence all the time is that it's very difficult to take that lesson on. It seems to be very difficult for Western governments to genuinely trust, genuinely delegate. Very easy for a general or a politician to say, we want to work with the grain of local society, we want to trust local society. But when it actually comes to confronting corruption, confronting disorder, it's almost impossible for someone to resist the temptation to get in there and start micromanaging. So, yes, I think Libya is a good development. We've managed to do it without deploying troops on the ground. My fear, though, in the future is that these tendencies, these exaggerated fears, this great optimism, this desire to micromanage, will mean that unless we're very careful, the intervention or the intervention after will find ourselves being dragged back into the same situation. So hopefully we take the right lesson from Libya. The right lesson from Libya is it's a good intervention because it's less of an intervention.
Less of an intervention. But going back to Afghanistan, if what you say is true, a lot of the blame must presumably fall on the Foreign Office, because they are the people supposed to be providing the long-term intelligence, supposed to be in close contact with all the local groups, supposed to understand terribly well. Are they?
I think the Foreign Office is in a real problem. One of the problems has been, since 2001, there's been an incredible focus on fashionable management jargon. People haven't been investing in language learning. People haven't been promoted for area expertise. So you look at the embassy in Kabul 2 years ago, out of 300 people in the embassy, there were only 3 people who could speak Dari at a basic operational level.
What?
So it's a shocking situation. And the only hope of keeping military, politicians, journalists balanced, having another voice in the room, is to have people who are genuinely confident specialists in the region who can say, this isn't going to work. And there simply aren't enough people around doing that.
It seems like a catch-22 or a chicken and egg question here, though, because were the British to be so involved overseas that they had all the language specialists in the Foreign Office and they knew exactly what was going on in these different countries, then they wouldn't be such a target for Al-Qaeda and others. I mean, the concern that the problem of terrorism on an international scale directed against the British as well as the Americans has to do with neo-imperialism. So would it not be better for the British to retreat into being like some of the other European states who don't profess to be global powers?
I disagree. I don't think it's an either-or choice of either you do absolutely nothing or you plough in with 150,000 troops. I think it makes a lot of sense for a country like Britain to retain serious expertise, but by that we would mean 2 or 3 people in an embassy who spoke the language well and knew the country well. That's not being a neo-imperial power.
But what's 2 or 3 in every embassy with every language specialisation around how much of the world? That's a huge Foreign Office.
It's not actually that large. The entire budget of the Foreign Office at the moment is under £1 billion a year. And we have a lot of staff. It's just that our staff are not encouraged to focus on languages and area expertise. It's not a huge call, but it would be a change in culture. It would be a change in culture would say we're going to take other people's countries seriously.
Frank Ledwidge.
Rory, do you think there's a danger of a determinist approach from the military? I mean, we have a fairly large expeditionary warfare-led, unfortunately now, military infrastructure. All the services are geared towards intervention. Do you think there's a risk in the future that combined with a little bit of enthusiasm from Libya might well force events, as it were?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think if you've got the capacity, there is a real temptation to use it.
Use it or lose it, as the army keeps saying.
Absolutely. I also think that there's a further problem, which is our relationship with the United States. I mean, one of the reasons why generals have been so relentlessly optimistic is they're a small partner in these wars, and they don't want to be perceived by the United States as being wimps. In Afghanistan, very, very common, because I spent a lot of time with Americans, for them to say that ISAF stood for I Saw Americans Fight. Now, this is not something that people talk about in Britain because it's deeply offensive to the British military. But of course the British military pick up that the Americans believe they're doing 90% of the heavy lifting, and they want to be even more gung-ho than Petraeus. So that we're now in a situation where, as the Americans draw down their troops steeply, there's huge reluctance from the senior command in Britain to draw down troops as steeply in Britain.
Sorry.
Failure not being an option.
Failure not being an option, and everybody getting a medal afterwards, all the generals. The other part, if you like, of the establishment we haven't talked about in this regard is, of course, the intelligence services themselves. Gordon Corera, as our intelligence services man, you've written a biography of MI6, which we'll come on to in a minute, but towards the end of that, you're highly critical of their role, particularly in Iraq, in the run-up to that war.
Well, yes, I think there's issues there about why the intelligence was wrong and turned out to be dud, but also, which links to what Frank was talking about as well, in terms of proximity to power and closeness to power and willingness to speak truth to power. And I think there'll be a lot of people who would question whether they simply got too close, whether they weren't willing to keep their distance from policy.
And in the book, you make the point that I was very surprised by how little the head of MI6 would see of the Prime Minister during the Cold War. Almost never.
Well, that's right. In the 80s, there'd be a 45-minute meeting every 6 months. They were basically left to get on with things. And in the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, it left MI6 feeling a bit lost, because they'd lost one of their defining features, which was fighting the Russians, fighting the Soviets in the Cold War. And the Cabinet Secretary would say, in the run-up to 9/11, before that, he would struggle to get the Chief of MI6 onto the Prime Minister's diary to see him. Then suddenly, with 9/11, there is this enormous shift in which they're there every day, in the bunker, in Downing Street, briefing the Prime Minister, and it is seductive. And when you get to the run-up to the war with Iraq, at one point, Tony Blair turns to Richard Dearlove, the Chief of MI6, and he says, "Richard, my fate is in your hands."
And that's wonderful for somebody because whose institution was in doubt, because every institution is biased, and suddenly you've got this surge of power and influence.
That's right, and it answered those insecurities that had grown up since the end of the Cold War, I think.
And so those people who say what really went wrong with the WMD intelligence was that the politicians arrogantly and aggressively pushed MI6 far too hard and too far, and then overwrote what came back again. You would say, well, actually, a part of the story is also that MI6 were too pushy about what they, in fact, didn't know. I
think that's right. And I think, if you want to understand what went wrong, a lot of the intelligence was simply dud. It was wrong intelligence. You can do no worse than go read Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana, which is the story of an MI6 desperate for intelligence, and which believes when a vacuum cleaner salesman passes off diagrams of his latest model, the atomic pile, claiming they're weapons of mass destruction, and they're eagerly snapped up by an intelligence service. Now, in a sense, that's what happened with the 45 minutes and some of the other claims, is that the quality control failed, and false intelligence got through to into the system. There's an interesting question about why the quality control failed. Was it proximity to power? Was it institutional failure? Was it the seductiveness? And I think that's still being very much argued about and contested even within MI6. You'll hear different views about whether it was they got too close to power, or whether it was a different problem that caused it.
You mentioned Graham Greene there. One of the things about your book is that you do use John le Carré and Ian Fleming and so on as a way of sort of lenses, I suppose, through which to look. You've talked to lots of former spies, but you also think that the sort of fictional aura around them is not meaningless.
No, that's right. I think one of the ways you can see the evolution of MI6 from the start of the Cold War, 1945, to the present, is through the tension, if you like, between Ian Fleming's James Bond and John le Carré's Smiley. On the one hand, with Bond, you have aggressive, gung-ho, morally confident, black and white worldview. Let's do things. On the other hand, you have Smiley, donnish, a bit podgy, cerebral, sees the complexity and the moral ambiguities of the world. And there's the tension there between covert action, the Bond world, and intelligence gathering, the Smiley world. And when you start the Cold War, MI6 is pretty gung-ho. It's aggressive, dropping agents behind enemy lines, trying to do things like in the Second World War, SOE did. There's not quite a licence to kill, but they certainly consider it and discuss that. But it gets them into all kinds of trouble. And it's a pretty amateurish service, and it's penetrated by its enemy. So then you have a swing towards, if you like, intelligence gathering, professionalisation, and you get the kind of more Smiley-like Moscow rules, Moscow men who become the master race within MI6 and the dominant strand. But in turn, that becomes very introspective, reflective, the world of spy versus spy, the world of Tinker Tailor, and it becomes almost paralysing as you get
too cerebral,
clever men who think too much and do too little, essentially through that period in the 60s and 70s, and they're not conducting aggressive operations against the enemy. By the time you get to the end of the Cold War, then, you have a new tension, which is, well, what are we for? I mean, what's the purpose of a service which had been defined so much by the Cold War? And a new strain of modernisers emerge who say, we need to do things, we need to be close to the rest of Whitehall, we need to have an impact on policy, and that in turn leads you through 9/11 and explains to some extent that proximity which emerges over Iraq.
There are all sorts of heroes and villains in this, and you go into the Philby case very interestingly. But one of the people that we haven't talked about very much, who seems extraordinary to me, is Daphne Park. Just paint us a little portrait of why we, she had a sort of public profile later on at Oxford College.
A principal of Somerville in Oxford, a baroness, member of the House of Lords.
Absolutely, fine college. But her career was extraordinary, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, I charted at the start, just after the Second World War, when she is in Vienna hunting Nazi scientists. Then she moves into MI6, goes to Moscow, and really I focus on her time in the Congo, 1960-61, which is one of the great crises of the Cold War, largely forgotten, in which the Cold War really comes to Africa for the first time. And Daphne Park, this young intelligence officer, is right at the heart of it. And one of the people she's got to know and has a relationship with is Patrice Lumumba, who some of her colleagues would like to see killed, and there's memos from the Foreign Office saying we should get rid of him because they think he's dangerous and he's getting too close to the communists, the CIA plot to kill him. And she's right at the heart there of one of the most complex and intriguing crises, where you see some of the real tensions about how far an intelligence service should go, what should it get involved in, how dirty should its hands get, if you like.
And she had to make very difficult moral choices there. And she's also, in terms of the sort of world of Le Carré or Ian Fleming or whatever else, a most unlikely looking spy, which is wonderful for her.
Yes, she is. I mean,
she describes herself, I think, as a
fat missionary, who would never have been able to use her charms to beguile anyone and become their agent. And that's part of the fascination with her. She's this wonderful character who becomes a significant figure in MI6, a controller of MI6 in the end.
Rory Stewart.
I knew Daphne from when I was a child, and what always struck me about her, and I think what we're losing, is that she was a real apostle of common sense. She was a great opponent of the Iraq War, very doubtful about what we were doing in Afghanistan, and very much represented an old Britain, which I'm afraid we're losing, which is that she took very seriously the idea of caution about knowing a lot about countries and about not plunging in. And that seems to have been replaced by a certain kind of superficial slickness.
She definitely came from the world in which it was about deep knowledge of countries and cultures, and you can see that in the way she builds relationships with Africans in the Congo, or when she's in Hanoi in Vietnam. It's all about building relationships, about talking to people on the ground, about getting to know them and getting a real sense of what's going on. Not just talking to elites, if you like, but getting that kind of deep knowledge. And I think that deep knowledge often, as you say, breeds a caution as well about some of the facile notions about what you can and can't do, including as an intelligence service.
I was going to ask a little bit about the difference between MI5 and MI6, particularly MI5 under Roger Hollis. Then I suddenly thought, you're no relation, are you, Rosemary?
Not as far as I know.
Right. Good, just clearing that one up. But two services which damagingly defined themselves almost against one another.
That's right. There was deep kind of the bureaucratic division you often get in intelligence services during the years, particularly in the Cold War, and you would find them investigating each other, and MI6 tasked with investigating MI5 during those famous mole hunts, looking to see whether Roger Hollis, the head of MI5, might be a Soviet agent. And that was that period where Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Le Carré really comes from, that very dark, bleak period, the wilderness of mirrors, where people just simply didn't know who was on which side. Now, the relationships have vastly improved, and they've had to work together to some extent in the world of counter-terrorism, where the threats cross borders.
I do want to say that the possible connection got me access to a number of Israelis that I wanted to interview back in 1989.
Frank?
One could argue, of course, that they have not outside the WMD fiasco, less than impressive record of strategic success prior to that. I mean, they failed to predict the fall of the Soviet Union, the invasion of the Falklands, the Balkan debacle, and of course 9/11 they played very little role in. More recently, we've had disasters in Afghanistan, the Mullah Mansour thing, where a grocer from Quetta on a lark was presented as a chief negotiator for the Taliban. I'm wondering, just would we notice if the blingy building on the other side of the Thames was sold to BP and the stronger, more competent officers were deployed to one floor in the Foreign Office? Would we notice?
Well, I think you raised some interesting questions there about where they've succeeded and where they've failed. I think some cases, stealing secrets is what they do, and they succeed and they fail at that. Iraq, they clearly failed. In other cases, negotiating with Gaddafi, it's quite interesting whether you see that as a success or not. And some of those areas you can see success in counter-terrorism. In other cases, though, they proved not very adept at, for instance, predicting. And I think there's a problem here where if you're looking to try and work out, well, what's happening within the Soviet Union, that's not really a secret to steal. It's something which is social change. What's the is the Arab Spring coming? Is Egypt going to succumb to a revolution? Very poor at things like that. Or, for instance, what do farmers in Helmand think? How will they respond to the presence of foreign troops? These are things we don't really do very well, and I think partly because the Secret Service says, well, these aren't, if you like, secrets. Yeah. So we're not going to. They're not our priority. We steal secrets from Al Qaeda, or we steal secrets from the Iranian nuclear program. We don't do that kind of stuff. But the problem is then, well, who does it? And I think there is a kind of institutional problem in government about who seeks out that kind of information.
Yeah.
Rosemary, Hollis, I want to bring you in on that because you've been particularly looking at the Libyan intervention and all the period, which is much in the newspapers at the moment, under the Blair and Brown governments, where at lots and lots of levels, intelligence, military and political, there was a flurry of very close contacts with the Gaddafi regime, which everybody is now coughing about and going pink about and pretending to be embarrassed about. But you would argue that there is, actually what was going on there was in many respects sensible.
And in many respects business as usual. The sense in which I've been looking at it is part of the British projection of power in the Middle East over a century and a half, 2 centuries. And what is the British way of doing business in the region? And we do need to see a separation between different professions. I'm slightly devastated by the findings of the books we're discussing today, insofar as the British military is not all it was definitely cracked up to be, and British intelligence bears a lot of responsibility, more responsibility, I think Gordon's saying in his book, than the Prime Minister and the Cabinet for the wrong intelligence on Iraq and its misuse. But in the case of Libya, I think we can see a distinction between a task to be done, which MI6 takes on. Gaddafi proves willing to give up his weapons of mass destruction or his program for obtaining them, provided the deal is right. And the people put in charge of working out the deal are MI6 in conjunction with the CIA, and is a very effective piece of work that they do. Now, what's causing so much consternation now with the revelations in Libya has to do with whether the extent to which the British were guilty of handing over Libyan nationals to the Libyans and knowing that they would be tortured. Now,
So one at the same time, on our television screens, we have film of Gaddafi's torture chamber. These people were killed by Gaddafi's regime, while, quite possibly, we ourselves were sending people back to the very same fate not long before.
And not long afterwards, having done the deal with Gaddafi. Now, I want to say a couple of things about this. First of all, that we should anticipate that a good member of MI6, a good spy, if you like, will conduct himself in a way that a politician would never be expected to. The politician has to seek the limelight, has to judge what will do him good in terms of his profile and therefore Britain's profile in the region. The spy is busy getting a deal with a very difficult man and his sons, for which you definitely need to be able to speak the language, and you definitely need to get into the fabric of the situation. And why not if you can get him to give up his programme? Good idea. The business of renditions has to be seen in a much broader context, and there I would want to take us back to the fact that the British, as well as the Americans, but principally the Americans, were very busy in Afghanistan in the 1980s helping the Mujahideen fight the Soviets, because we were in Cold War context. And we have been reluctant to go back to that prelude to 9/11. When we'd dispensed with them, they'd done their job, they got rid of the Soviets, we neglected them. A lot of the Arab volunteers that we'd encouraged and had gone via Egypt and Saudi Arabia to join the Mujahideen dispersed back to the Middle East.
Including to Libya?
Including to Libya, and they were not welcome in the 1990s by the governments who'd previously encouraged them to go and volunteer. And a lot of them were arrested and interrogated. And that, in the different Arab countries, now, depending on the British relationship with those countries, they were already sharing intelligence derived from these kinds of sources before 9/11,
Right.
before the whole fracas about renditions.
And looking ahead, Libya is now being widely hailed as a great triumph. It seems very early days. Sirte hasn't yet quite fallen. Gaddafi certainly hasn't been got. What conclusions do you draw about the relationship we should now be having with the transitional national government, transitional national council? What's going to happen next?
Very much in tune with what Rory Stewart is saying, that we've got to learn the lessons that Lawrence of Arabia wanted us to learn 100 years ago, basically that the Libyans have got to be free to make their own mistakes, and we should not be telling them who should be in their government.
Right. Frank, we mentioned Afghanistan. Rosemary's talking about Afghanistan there. In your book, you also argue that a lot of misremembering of Afghanistan has been important in the failures we've been discussing this morning.
Yes. For the Afghans, the equivalent battle to the Battle of Trafalgar and roll in the Joan of Arc and a little bit of Waterloo and the French resistance is the Battle of Maiwand. That was fought just outside the borders of Helmand now, but very near a British Army base. And this gave rise to what General Richards has called, quite rightly, the current Chief of Defence Staff, as the Maiwand factor. And essentially, as I mentioned before, this has produced the attitude over a period of a century or so of the British being the key enemy. And we simply didn't know that.
Rory?
I think the fundamental thing has to be that we have to be more serious. We have to be more serious about thinking about SIS, about the army, about the Foreign Office, about politicians. We need to be more serious about foreign policy. We spend eye-watering sums of money. Taking debt and veterans costs £6 billion a year in places like Afghanistan. And I'm afraid we approach it almost as dilettantes. We go in and out on 6-month tours. People aren't going outside embassies. This is no way to conduct ourselves. Britain needs to look at itself. It needs to recognise that the last 15 years has been shameful.
Well, I've spent my professional career, I suppose, as an academic and in various think tanks, trying to study Britain's adaptation to decline as played out in the Middle East. And I'm beginning to worry, inclusive of the intervention in Libya, whether successful or not, that the British haven't yet adapted. And I'm wondering if there is such a thing as adaptation to be had.
Frank?
How are we seen in the Arab world? Big question.
Oh, it was miserable visiting various Arab countries in the context of the invasion of Iraq. Miserable. I would be asked to explain what on earth are the British doing. They surely should know better. And if I tried to give a sophisticated explanation, I would simply be told, oh, rubbish. It's about oil and sucking up to the Americans.
Gordon,
I mean, I think one of the interesting things is not just how we're seen in the Arab world, but how we see ourselves, and the mismatch sometimes between the way we see ourselves and our interventions and the way they're seen by others. And I'm not sure we've really got into our heads that debate yet about how we want to be seen and what our place is. And I think until we resolve that, we're going to keep intervening.
And I think we've got 10 years damage to make up now.
Very quickly, Rory Stewart.
So much deference from journalists, from academics, people not exposing this, not criticising this, and that's the real question that we need to remain with.
Well, I think this discussion will have upset quite a few people, but I hope they'll at least agree that it was an important one. Thank you to all my guests today. Gordon Corera's The Art of Betrayal, Life and Death in the British Secret Service, and Frank Ledwidge's Losing Small Wars are both out now. Rory Stewart's Can Intervention Works, published next week, and Rosemary Hollis's Britain and the Middle East in the 9/11 era was out last year. She's taking part as well in a briefing at the Middle East Association on Libya after the revolution on Thursday morning. Next week, we have Global Ambition and some more Lessons of Empire with Jeremy Paxman, Sun Shu-yun, Richard Gott and Mariam Jam. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this Radio 4 podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you might like to try others like it, such as In Our Time or Thinking Aloud, both of which are also available from the Radio 4 website. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, and the Conservative Party conference here is in full swing. We're up here for one of the most politically charged and important discussions we've had on Start the Week. In essence, whether or not Britain's military involvement overseas does any good at all. Rory Stewart is a Conservative MP, former soldier, former diplomat, including in Iraq, who asks in his new book, Can Intervention Work? This is a tale which certainly includes the role of spooks, and the BBC's Gordon Corera has written a new history of MI6, teasing out the racy fiction of Le Carré and Ian Fleming from the facts recalled by former spies. Rosemary Hollis of London City University has been studying our latest intervention, very much in today's headlines, in Libya. But we're going to start with one of the most devastating books on British policy I have read. Frank Ledwidge is a former military intelligence officer, and
if you're taken hostage, you can rely on British troops to defend you and to rescue you. However, when we come to fighting wars like this, the legends we've beguiled ourselves with of Malaya, Northern Ireland, simply don't apply.
See, I think if you stopped most people in the street and you said what happened in Basra, if they remembered it at all, they'd say, "Oh, we sorted Basra out, didn't we? We did well, and we've moved on."
Well, we certainly moved on, and in one sense we sorted Basra out.
And we were rescued in the end. It was the Americans.
Yes, we were bailed out. We were bailed out by the Americans and the Iraqi army in early 2008.
And you argue that what then happened in southern Afghanistan, in Helmand province, was partly a result of what had gone wrong in Afghanistan.
In
Iraq.
So. I believe explicitly so, and several generals have got themselves into a bit of hot water over this since. There was an explicit
title of his angry and detailed book says it all. He's called it simply Losing Small Wars, British Military Failure in Afghanistan and Iraq. Frank, let's talk first of all about Iraq, the Basra failure. And you would describe these, both what's happened in Basra and what's still happening in Helmand, as defeats.
Certainly Basra was a defeat, a serious defeat, and I'd categorise it possibly as the most humiliating British military adventure certainly since the Second World War and arguably since Singapore. I mean, you can't compare the casualties, but certainly I think the impact are comparable.
And in essence, to remind people, we went in to protect and help the people of this important, very large southern city in Iraq. And really quite quickly, we in effect handed...
A long time ago, the Shia population of Basra, of course, has suffered serious casualties. And the Sunnis, of course, in Basra, are subject to something like ethnic cleansing. Now, there are some left, But it's been a very, very unpleasant time there. And I was told last week concerning security in Basra, I was thinking of going back and seeing what we'd achieved, and I was told you will last 30 minutes on the streets of Basra now before being kidnapped.
Why do we never read in the news that we were defeated in Basra? I mean, why does no one talk about this?
I think there's a political consensus, an understandable political consensus, but also there's the very, very legitimate aspect of looking after the interests and morale of our troops. Now, you will find nothing in my book critical of the British soldier. As a defence force, they're second to none. If we're attacked by conventional forces...
Control to the local bad guys and retreated, in your view, to a little bastion camp outside.
Yes, the city was essentially surrendered to a fairly savage bunch of militias on the basis that these now constituted the police. Of course, there was a rhetoric to this, and that rhetoric, as you mentioned, revolved around protecting the people, and the military rhetoric of entering Basra, protecting the people, looking after their interests. And what the people of Basra, the Basra'is, wanted was simple security, and devolving responsibility for that security to a bunch of religious, fanatical militias was a serious dereliction of duty. And we let them seriously down and constituted a surrender, in my view.
And many, many people actually had to leave Basra and have gone into exile as a result of Britain's involvement.
Yes, the Christian population is essentially eviscerated. It's essentially no longer there. The Jewish population